In today's video, I'm going to be looking at the life and times of St Valentine, the patron saint of lovers. So who was St Valentine, and how did he get mixed up with wolves, whips and weddings? Let's start with what we know about Valentine. We know he was a Christian priest who lived in 3rd century Rome, that he died around 270 AD, and that his holy day has been celebrated on February the 14th since 496. There are no records of his life dating to the 3rd century. Most of what we know about Valentine comes from a chronicle published in Nuremberg in Germany in 1496. In this modern stained glass window, we're presented with the image of Valentine dressed in priestly robes. In one hand he is holding a sword, in the other a branch from a pine tree. The sword tells us how he died. The pine branch connects him with the month of February and with corporal and spiritual purity. 3rd century Rome was a dangerous place for Christians like Valentine. This was because they were seen as social deviants. Like the Jews, Christians were required to renounce all other gods, and so Christians did not worship state gods or join in Rome's many pagan celebrations. This distanced them from the majority of the Roman population, who were happy to revel in Rome's many religious festivals. The problem for the Christians was that only the Jews were exempted from the obligations of making the public sacrifices mandated by the Roman authorities. For that privilege, the Jews had to pay what was called the Jewish tax, the proceeds of which were used to pay for the upkeep of the Temple of Jupiter in Rome. The pagan majority believed wholeheartedly in their gods. They believed the performance of cult offerings and rituals was essential to their well-being, and they thought the Christians were making their gods angry by not joining in. And so the Christians were deemed to be antisocial and threatening the peace and prosperity of the empire. The festivals were not the only problem. Christians also refused to do things like military service or take public office. Neither did they work in city workshops where idols and trinkets dedicated to the pagan gods were made. In fact, Christians were viewed as antisocial killjoys and as people who hated the finer things of life, such as good clothes, jewellery, music and dancing. On top of this, the pagans knew that Christians met in secret, in houses and in the tunnels dug under the city where they buried their dead. This, of course, fed the imagination of their pagan neighbours, and stories claiming that Christians practiced cannibalism and incest, two things the Romans absolutely abhorred, spread like wildfire through Roman society, making the persecution of Christians, well, acceptable. Another factor that made Rome a dangerous place was the state of the empire itself. The empire was faltering and splitting apart by the 3rd century. The emperors of Rome had lost control of a large part of the Eastern and Northern Empire, and there were periods of intermittent civil war. Emperor Claudius II, not the famous Claudius written about by Suetonius and Robert Graves, but a 3rd century general who was made emperor by his troops, began his mission to take control of Rome's dissenting provinces in 268. Claudius was a hardened and experienced soldier. He was physically strong, ruthless and cruel. He was the sort of man admired by fighting men, and he was emperor because his troops had declared him so. It was Claudius II who served Valentine his death sentence in 269, but we have no record of the charges laid out in that warrant. One of his crimes was almost certainly preaching Christianity against the opposition of the state's polytheistic religion. Another, surprisingly, may have been that he was marrying young people against Claudius's edict banning marriages in Rome. Bans on marriage were not unusual in times of crisis in ancient Rome. Marriage was a serious business, especially for the elite. The law pertaining to women and marriage was very ancient, and there were rules on marriage between different classes of citizens. No citizen could legally marry a prostitute or an actress, for instance, and provincial governors were banned from marrying local women. The authorities didn't want their provincial governors getting too friendly with the natives. The young men of Rome were required for military service, and there was a general belief that the presence of married men in the army had a feminizing effect on it. The Roman martial elite believed that men would be less willing to make the ultimate sacrifice if they had wives and children at home. And so there were strict rules on marriage for soldiers. In 269, Claudius needed all the soldiers he could muster, and so he banned all marriages and engagement in Rome. This is probably where St Valentine came into conflict with the Roman authorities. Being a good Christian, Valentine was probably marrying anyone who came to him and converting them to his religion, and in the process, both would have been viewed as criminal acts by the Roman authorities. However, Valentine's most heinous crime, certainly from his hagiographer's perspective, was that he tried to convert Claudius himself. It seems that Claudius was outraged by the idea of giving up everything he believed kept Rome great in return for salvation from a man his ancestors had executed as a common criminal. Claudius insisted the charismatic Valentine return to the old pagan ways, but Valentine refused. And so early on the morning of February the 14th, 269 AD, Valentine was led to the Flaminian Gate, where he was beaten with clubs and beheaded. Later, his broken body was taken away by his Christian friends and buried in a nearby cemetery. Then, Valentine disappears from the records for over 200 years. He reappears, or his feast day appears again in 496 AD. This is when our pious saint gets mixed up with wolves and whips. To find out more about this story, we have to begin with the archaic Roman calendar, where February was the last month of the year. The last month was a time of endings and beginnings, and of purification for the ancient Romans. It was the month of honouring the ancestors, celebrating family life, and preparing for the year to come. It was a time for spring cleaning, the house and the body. Cleanliness was next to godliness as far as the ancient Romans were concerned. Houses were swept, new clothes were brought, bodies were scourged and purged. After the 9-day festival of honouring the ancestors came the 3-day festival of Lupercalia, or the Wolf Festival. Lupercalia took place between the 13th and the 15th of February. The fact that St Valentine's Day falls slap bang in the middle of this ancient festival has prompted some scholars to suggest that Valentine's Day was deliberately placed there in the middle of February to replace this pagan festival with its nudity, gluttony, and fornication. The festival and its rituals remained incredibly popular even after the empire became officially Christian. It was a bloody, violent and sexually charged celebration of primal life forces and was associated with the mythical creatures, the fauns and satyrs. The festival was carried out by the priests of the wolf god Lupercus. In the legend of the founding of Rome, the brothers Romulus and Remus were suckled by a she-wolf called Lupa Romana. She nurtured them as if they were her own pups, and in the process she transferred some of her lupine characteristics, her strength, courage and ruthlessness. These were all qualities admired by the ancient Romans. And the she-wolf was a symbol of Roman power, both on the coinage and during the Republic and the Empire. Livy tells us that the first statue to the she-wolf suckling the twins was set up around 296 AD, and it was near the Lupercalia, a cave on the Palatine hill where the god Mars was said to have impregnated the twins' mother. This cave was the starting place for the 3-day festival. Goats and dogs were rounded up to be publicly sacrificed. The dogs represented the wolves and the goats the god Faunus, who was the Roman equivalent of the god Pan. All these gods were associated with the raw spirit of wild nature, unfettered sexual impulse, and fertility. 2 of the priests, usually young virile men, were chosen for special treatment during the festival. They had their foreheads anointed with the sacrificial blood of the animals. Then the blood was wiped off with a wad of wool dipped in milk. Now, when the Greeks and Romans speak of milk without qualification, they usually mean goat's milk or sheep's milk, and it's a reference to the fact that the chief of the gods, Zeus, or Jupiter as he was known to the Romans, was fed by a goat as an infant. By feeding on goat's milk, the god took on some of the goat's characteristics. Most conspicuously, he became horny and hairy and vigorous and animal-like. Anyone who knows anything about Greek mythology knows that Zeus, aka Jupiter, was incapable of remaining faithful to his long-suffering wife and went around fornicating with anything female, from nymphs to celestial cows. When the blood ritual was over, the feasting began. And at the end of the feast, the Luperci, that is the priests, cut the sacrificed animal skins into strips or whips. And then the final act of the fertility rite began. The 2 men who'd been singled out for special treatment, representing Romulus and Remus, then ran around the Palatine hill in goatskin loincloths, wielding these goatskin whips or febra. The women in the crowd held out their arms to be touched with these whips as the runners passed by. They believed that if they were touched by the blessed skins, they would be cleansed and made pure, ready to conceive. This bloody pagan ritual was, of course, highly popular with the masses, as you can imagine. But in 496, the Pope decreed an end to Lupercalia. by forbidding Christians to take part in it. We don't know when the Romans finally gave up their festival of wolves and whips, but we know St Valentine was established as a saint throughout medieval Europe. It seems that poets such as Geoffrey Chaucer and other medieval poets combined Valentine's story with the idea of courtly love, describing February as the month in which birds paired up and many flowers bloomed. And so Valentine's Day was born. Like many of the early saints, including St Christopher, Valentine was never formally canonised. Instead, he was acclaimed as a saint by the early Christian communities of Rome. In recent decades, the Catholic Church has removed the feast days of saints like Valentine and Christopher from the universal liturgical calendar. These saints remain saints, and their feast days may still be observed by parishes bearing their name, but to all intents and purposes, they are viewed as past their sell-by day by the Church. Valentine was moved from the general calendar of saints in 1969. However, as we know, that hasn't stopped the celebration of St Valentine's Day. Love is eternal, and his feast day continues to go from strength to strength, supported by the purveyors of wine and chocolates, perfume and flowers. Thank you for watching. If you would like to see more videos like this, please do the usual YouTube stuff. Hit the notification button, give us a like, and please don't forget to subscribe. Goodbye.